The stew bubbled in the iron pot, filling the dusty ranch kitchen with an aroma that made grown men weep. Rosalie Guthrie wiped sweat from her brow as she stirred the thick concoction, her first day at the Flying F Ranch hanging in the balance. She had traveled 200 miles by stagecoach to this desolate corner of Wyoming territory in 1875, chasing a dream that even she thought might be foolish until the moment the ranch foreman took his first taste. "Good Lord Almighty," Blake Foster muttered, his weathered face transformed by astonishment. He swallowed slowly, his eyes closing briefly before fixing on Rosalie with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "Miss Guthrie, I believe I'll keep you forever." Those words, spoken carelessly over a pot of stew, would change the course of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Rosalie had arrived at the Flying F that very morning, exhausted and uncertain. The advertisement had been specific. Wanted. Cook for cattle ranch. Must withstand harsh conditions and difficult men. Pay modest, but room and board provided. She had responded out of desperation more than anything else, having lost her position at a respectable Philadelphia home when the family moved west. At 23, with no family and dwindling savings, she had taken a risk that seemed better than the alternatives. The stagecoach had deposited her at the crossroads 5 miles from the ranch, where she waited with her single trunk until a wagon driven by a grizzled ranch hand named Pete collected her. He spoke little during their bumpy journey, merely pointing out landmarks with grunts that could have meant anything. "Ranch ain't had a proper cook in 8 months, he finally volunteered, as they approached a cluster of buildings nestled against rolling hills. "Last fella left after the boys played one too many jokes with rattlesnakes." Rosalie swallowed hard, wondering what she had gotten herself into. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected a main house, bunkhouse, barn, corrals, and several outbuildings spread across a well-worn yard. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and several horses nickered in a nearby corral. Pete had delivered her to the main house where the ranch foreman, Blake Foster, had been waiting on the porch. At 30, Blake was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His handshake was firm, but not crushing, and he'd looked her over with a frankness that was assessing rather than improper. "Miss Guthrie," he'd said, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair. "I'll be honest, most of the men thought Mr. Thompson was crazy to hire a woman sight unseen. The ranch owner is in Denver on business, so you'll be answering to me until his return. The kitchen's yours, but if you can't feed 20 hungry cowboys 3 times a day, this arrangement won't last." "I understand, Mr. Foster," she had replied, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "I can cook for 2 or 20. Just show me to my quarters in the kitchen, and I'll begin immediately." He'd seemed surprised by her directness, but nodded and carried her trunk to a small room off the kitchen. It was simple but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook for clothes, and a small window that looked out toward the distant mountains. "Dinner's at 6, he'd told her. "The men have been living on salt pork and beans for months. Anything would be an improvement, but they're not easy to impress." Rosalie had unpacked quickly, changing from her travel-stained dress into a simpler one with an apron. She had surveyed the kitchen with a critical eye. It was better stocked than she'd feared, with a good iron stove, basic staples, and even some dried herbs hanging from the rafters. In the root cellar, she found potatoes, carrots, and onions, and the smokehouse yielded bacon and a haunch of venison. With determination, she had set to work, deciding that a hearty stew would be the perfect introduction to her cooking. She browned the meat with bacon fat, added vegetables and broth, and seasoned it with her own blend of herbs and spices that she'd carried all the way from Philadelphia. And now, with the dinner hour approaching, Blake Foster stood in her kitchen, having wandered in to check on her progress, only to be captured by the enticing aroma. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the pot. "Please," she replied, ladling a small portion into a bowl and passing it to him with a piece of the fresh bread she'd managed to bake. That was when he'd uttered those fateful words about keeping her forever, his expression shifting from surprise to something warmer that made Rosalie's cheeks flush. "It's just stew, Mr. Foster," she said, trying to sound businesslike despite the flutter in her stomach. "No, madam," he replied, setting the bowl down. "That's not just stew. That's a miracle in a pot. The men will think they've died and gone to heaven." And they did. That evening, as Rosalie served her stew to the assembled cowhands in the ranch's dining hall, silence fell over the usually boisterous group. Men who normally bolted their food without tasting, it slowed down, savoring each bite. Several asked for seconds, and one elderly ranch hand with a silver beard actually removed his hat in respect. "Miss Guthrie," he said solemnly, "if you cook like this every day, there ain't a man here who will ever complain about anything again." That night, exhausted but pleased, Rosalie wrote in her journal, "Perhaps I have found a place after all. The work will be hard, but the appreciation is genuine. Mr. Foster seems fair, if somewhat intimidating. I shall have to be careful not to read too much into his compliments." The next morning, Rosalie rose before dawn to prepare breakfast. She was kneading dough for biscuits when Blake entered the kitchen, startling her. "You're up early," she said, flour dusting her hands. "Always am," he replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd already brewed. "Ranch doesn't run itself." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "The men are still talking about that stew." "I'm glad they enjoyed it," Rosalie said, focusing on her task to hide her pleasure at the compliment. "What's your story, Miss Guthrie?" Blake asked suddenly. "Philadelphia's a long way from Wyoming." Rosalie's hand stilled momentarily. "I needed work, Mr. Foster. The advertisement promised fair treatment and distance from civilization. Both appealed to me. Most women run toward civilization, not away from it." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not most women." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm beginning to see that." He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "I'll be back with the men at noon. Don't work too hard." As the days passed, Rosalie settled into a routine. She rose early to prepare breakfast, spent the mornings baking and starting preparations for lunch and dinner, took a brief rest in the afternoon, and finished the day's cooking before retiring shortly after the evening meal. The work was exhausting but satisfying, and the men's appreciation was genuine. Blake Foster remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, but maintained a certain distance. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an unreadable expression that made her pulse quicken. Other times he seemed almost to avoid her company, taking his meals quickly or sending another hand to deliver messages about meal times or supplies. A week after her arrival, Rosalie was startled by a commotion in the yard. Through the kitchen window, she saw several riders approaching at speed, one slumped in the saddle and supported by another. She wiped her hands and hurried outside as the men dismounted. "What happened?" she asked, as Blake and two others helped the injured man down. "Rustlers," Blake said grimly. "They caught Tommy checking the north fence line, shot him before he could get away." The wounded cowboy was young, barely 20, with blood soaking his shirt. "Bring him to the kitchen," Rosalie said decisively. "The table is sturdy enough." Blake glanced at her in surprise, but nodded, and they carried Tommy inside. Rosalie quickly cleared the table and spread clean cloths over it. She had helped nurse wounded soldiers during the war, a fact she hadn't mentioned in her application, and moved with practiced efficiency. "I need hot water, clean bandages, and whiskey," she instructed, and the men scrambled to obey. The bullet had passed through Tommy's shoulder, missing vital organs but leaving a nasty wound that was bleeding heavily. Rosalie cleaned it thoroughly, applied pressure to stop the bleeding, and then stitched it closed with neat, even sutures from the small medical kit one of the hands retrieved from the bunkhouse. Throughout, she spoke calmly to Tommy, distracting him with questions about his home in Missouri and his favorite foods. When she finished, she administered laudanum for the pain and instructed two of the men to carry him to his bunk. Only then did she notice Blake watching her from the doorway, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. "Volunteer nursing during the war," she replied, washing blood from her hands in a basin. "I was young, but they needed every pair of hands they could get." "You're full of surprises, Miss Guthrie." She glanced up at him. "Life rarely follows the path we expect, Mr. Foster." He nodded slowly. "Tommy would have been in trouble if we'd had to take him all the way to town. The doctor's often away seeing patients on distant ranches." He hesitated. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said simply. That evening, after serving dinner to the subdued crew, Rosalie found a small bundle outside her door, a package of fine tea, the kind that was expensive and hard to come by in these parts. There was no note, but she knew who had left it. The next morning, Blake lingered over breakfast, watching as she prepared bread dough for the day. "Doc Miller should be by today to check on Tommy," he said. "I told him we had the situation in hand, but he'll want to see for himself." "Of course," Rosalie replied, focusing on her kneading. "The tea? Was it to your liking?" Blake asked, almost hesitantly. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "It was perfect, thank you. It's been months since I've had anything so fine." A brief smile crossed his face. "Good. I remembered you mentioned missing a proper cup of tea." The fact that he had remembered such a small detail from one of their brief conversations warmed something inside her. "How is it that you're the foreman here, Mr. Foster?" she asked, curious about this man who seemed both rugged cowboy and thoughtful gentleman. Blake set his coffee cup down. "I came west after the war. Needed open spaces after 4 years of battlefields and trenches. Started as a hand, worked my way up. Mr. Thompson recognized I had a head for the business side of ranching, not just the physical work." He paused. "What about you? How does a Philadelphia lady end up cooking in Wyoming territory?" Rosalie's hands stilled on the dough. "My parents died when I was 16. Influenza. I had no other family, so I supported myself by cooking for a wealthy family. When they decided to move to California, I found myself without a position." She shrugged slightly. "I could have sought another household position, but I wanted something different." "Something different," Blake repeated. "That's a delicate way of putting it." "Is it so strange to want to determine one's own fate?" she asked. "No," he said softly. "Not strange at all." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the doctor, a gruff man in his 60s who examined Tommy and pronounced Rosalie's treatment damn fine work for a cook. He left additional medicines and instructions, which Rosalie noted carefully. Over the next few weeks, a subtle shift occurred in her relationship with Blake. He began to seek her company more often, sometimes joining her in the kitchen in the quiet evenings after dinner, ostensibly to discuss ranch business, but often staying to talk about books they had read or places they had seen. She learned that he had grown up in Virginia, the son of a horse breeder, and had fought for the Union despite his Southern roots, a choice that had estranged him from his family. He had a younger sister somewhere in Boston, whom he hadn't seen in years, but corresponded with regularly. He loved poetry but would never admit it to the men, and he dreamed of someday having his own small ranch rather than managing someone else's. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of cooking that had begun in her mother's kitchen, and her brief experience as a nurse during the war. She admitted that she sometimes felt lonely, but valued her independence too much to compromise it for security. "You're braver than most men I know," Blake told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Coming all this way on your own, starting over. Not brave," she countered, "simply practical. And perhaps a little foolhardy. Practical would have been staying in Philadelphia and finding another position in a nice house with regular hours and proper society," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "Perhaps I wanted more than practicality could offer?" she replied softly, not quite meeting his eyes. The evening air was cool, and she shivered slightly in her light dress. Without comment, Blake removed his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body, and it carried his scent, leather, horses, and something uniquely him. Rosalie murmured her thanks, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at his nearness. As September gave way to October, the ranch became busier with preparations for winter. Cattle had to be moved to lower pastures, hay stored, and buildings repaired before the first snow. Rosalie found herself baking more, preparing heartier meals to sustain the men through longer, colder days of work. One afternoon, as she was returning from the root cellar with arms full of vegetables, she literally bumped into Blake coming around the corner of the house. Potatoes and carrots went flying, and she would have fallen had he not caught her arms to steady her. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, looking up at him. Blake didn't immediately release her. Instead, he stood motionless, his hands warm on her arms, his face just inches from hers. For a breathless moment, Rosalie thought he might kiss her and realized with a shock that she wanted him to. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Blake stepped back, releasing her, and bent to help gather the scattered vegetables. "Mr. Thompson is returning today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "He'll want to meet you." Anxiety fluttered in Rosalie's chest. "I hope he'll be pleased with my work." "He'd be a fool not to be," Blake replied, handing her the last potato. Gregory Thompson proved to be a surprise. Rather than the gruff older man Rosalie had imagined, the ranch owner was in his 40s, well-dressed, with the manners of an Eastern gentleman rather than a Western cattleman. He greeted Rosalie warmly, complimenting her on the transformation of the ranch's dining table. "I've heard nothing but praise in my correspondence with Mr. Foster," Thompson said over dinner that evening. "The men seem positively devoted to you. Miss Guthrie?" "They're easily won over by regular meals and fresh bread, Mr. Thompson," she replied modestly. "Don't let her fool you," Blake interjected. "She's not only the best cook in the territory, but saved young Tommy's life last month when he was shot by rustlers." Thompson raised his eyebrows. "Indeed, it seems I've acquired a treasure in you, Miss Guthrie." Throughout the meal, Rosalie noticed Thompson watching the interactions between her and Blake with interest. Once, when Blake passed her the salt, their fingers brushed and she caught the ranch owner hiding a smile behind his napkin. That night, unable to sleep, Rosalie stepped outside for fresh air. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamond dust across the black sky. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the crisp air. "Beautiful night," came Blake's voice from the shadows, startling her. He stepped forward, and moonlight revealed he was still fully dressed, as if he too had been unable to sleep. "I'm sorry if I frightened you," he said, stopping a few feet away. "It's all right," she replied. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." He moved to stand beside her, both of them looking up at the star-filled sky. "I've been thinking?" "About what?" she asked, her heart beating faster. "About how different the ranch is since you came." He turned to face her. "About how different I am." Rosalie's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Foster." "Blake," he interrupted softly. "After all this time, I think you might call me Blake, at least when we're alone." "Blake," she repeated, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. "I don't understand what you're saying." He took a step closer. "I think you do, Rosalie. I think you feel it too." Before she could respond, the ranch house door opened, spilling light onto the porch. Gregory Thompson stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Ah, there you are, Foster," he called. "I wanted to discuss those cattle contracts before turning in." Blake stepped back, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Of course, sir. I'll be right there." Thompson nodded and went back inside, leaving the door ajar. "We'll continue this conversation another time," Blake said quietly. And then he was gone, leaving Rosalie alone with her turbulent thoughts. The next day brought a flurry of activity as Thompson reviewed ranch operations and made plans with Blake for the coming winter. Rosalie saw little of either man except at mealtimes, where conversation remained focused on business. 2 days later, Thompson departed for Denver again, promising to return before the first heavy snow. Before leaving, he took Rosalie aside. "Miss Guthrie, I want you to know how pleased I am with your work here," he said warmly. "I'm increasing your wages by 20%, effective immediately." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she replied, genuinely surprised. "That's very generous." He smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Not generosity recognition of value. And may I say, it's not just your cooking skills that have improved life at the Flying F." His gaze drifted meaningfully to where Blake stood by the corral, seeing Thompson's horse readied for departure. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Rosalie said carefully. Thompson chuckled. "I've known Blake Foster for 5 years, Miss Guthrie. I've never seen him quite so attentive to anyone before." He patted her hand. "Just an observation." After Thompson's departure, Blake seemed distant, immersed in work, and often absent from the ranch house for days at a time as he checked on distant parts of the property. When present, he was unfailingly polite, but avoided being alone with Rosalie, leaving her confused and increasingly certain she had imagined the connection between them. October brought the first snow, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning of winter's approach. The ranch hands worked longer hours, and Rosalie found herself rising even earlier to ensure hot breakfasts before dawn and preparing stews and roasts that could simmer all day while she baked bread and made desserts. One afternoon, as she was returning from gathering eggs, she noticed a rider approaching from the east, a woman, riding astride rather than side saddle. Her dress practical for travel, but finer than anything seen around the ranch. Curious, Rosalie waited as the woman dismounted gracefully and approached. "Hello," the stranger called, removing her gloves. She was perhaps 30, attractive in a refined way, with dark hair neatly pinned under her hat. "I'm looking for the Flying F Ranch. Am I in the right place?" "You are," Rosalie confirmed. "I'm Rosalie Guthrie, the cook. Can I help you?" The woman smiled. "I'm Clara Wilson. I've come to see Blake Foster. Is he available?" Something cold settled in Rosalie's stomach. "Mr. Foster is checking cattle in the south pasture. He should return by dinner time. Would you like to wait inside?" "That would be lovely, thank you," Clara replied, following Rosalie to the house. "Blake and I are old friends. I'm sure he'll be surprised to see me." Rosalie showed Clara to the small parlor and brought her tea, all while maintaining a composed exterior that belied her inner turmoil. Who was this woman to Blake? The familiar way she used his first name suggested intimacy. When Blake returned at dusk, covered in dust and clearly tired, Rosalie met him at the door. "You have a visitor," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Miss Clara Wilson is waiting in the parlor." Blake's expression changed from surprise to something unreadable. "Clara, here?" He ran a hand through his hair. "I should clean up before seeing her." "She's been waiting several hours," Rosalie pointed out. "Perhaps you should at least greet her first." He nodded slowly. "You're right, of course." Rosalie returned to the kitchen, determinedly focusing on dinner preparations while straining to hear the murmur of voices from the parlor. After about 15 minutes, Blake appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Miss Guthrie, would you mind setting an extra place for dinner? Miss Wilson will be staying the night before continuing her journey tomorrow." "Of course," Rosalie replied, not looking up from the carrots she was chopping. "There's plenty." "Thank you," he said, hesitating as if wanting to say more before turning away. Dinner that evening was an exercise in restraint for Rosalie. Clara was charming and well-spoken, clearly educated and familiar with both Eastern society and Western ways. She explained that she was traveling to San Francisco to join her brother's business venture and had detoured to visit dear friends along the way. "Blake and I met in Denver 3 years ago," she told Rosalie. "He was delivering cattle for Mr. Thompson, and I was visiting friends. We became quite close." The slight pause before close spoke volumes, and Rosalie nodded politely while feeling as if the floor were shifting beneath her feet. Blake, for his part, seemed uncomfortable with the conversation, steering it toward news from Denver and Clara's brother's business plans. After dinner, Rosalie excused herself to clean the kitchen, ignoring Blake's unusual offer to help. Through the window, she could see him and Clara walking in the yard, their heads bent close in conversation. Later, she heard him escorting Clara to the guest room at the far end of the house before his footsteps passed her door on the way to his own quarters. Sleep eluded Rosalie that night. She tossed and turned, replaying every interaction with Blake in her mind, wondering if she had misread his interest entirely. Perhaps what she had taken for special attention was merely his natural kindness. Perhaps his almost confession that night under the stars had been something else entirely. Morning brought no clarity. Rosalie prepared breakfast as usual, and if the biscuits were a bit harder than normal or the coffee stronger, no one commented. Clara appeared looking fresh and well-rested, while Blake seemed as if he hadn't slept at all. "Miss Wilson will be leaving after breakfast," Blake announced. "I'll be riding with her as far as the Chapman Creek crossing to ensure she's on the right trail." Rosalie nodded, serving them efficiently before retreating to begin bread for the day. She heard them depart an hour later, Clara's laugh drifting back on the morning breeze. The day stretched endlessly. Rosalie worked with mechanical precision, her thoughts far from the task at hand. When Blake returned mid-afternoon, she was kneading dough with such force that flour dusted her arms to the elbows. "Miss Guthrie," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Do you have a moment?" "I'm rather busy, Mr. Foster," she replied, not looking up. "Rosalie, please." The soft plea in his voice made her pause. hands stilling in the dough. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Clara Wilson is an old friend," he said without preamble. "Nothing more." Rosalie resumed kneading. "Your relationship with Miss Wilson is none of my concern, Mr. Foster. It is, if it's causing misunderstandings between us." He stepped closer. "There was a time when there might have been something between Clara and me, but that was years ago. She's on her way to be married in San Francisco." Rosalie's hands stilled again. "Married?" "Yes. Her fiancé is in business with her brother." Blake moved closer still until he was standing directly across the table from her. "She came to tell me in person, believing I might have expectations." "Oh," Rosalie said softly, understanding dawning. "I see. Do you?" Blake asked, his voice low. "Do you see that the only woman I have expectations about is standing right in front of me?" Rosalie's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Blake!" The kitchen door swung open as Pete, the ranch hand who had first collected her from the stagecoach, burst in. "Boss, we got trouble," he said urgently. "Riders coming, and they don't look friendly. Might be the same bunch that shot Tommy." Blake's expression hardened instantly. "How many?" "6, maybe 7, coming from the east. Get the men ready, rifles, but no shooting unless I give the word." Blake turned to Rosalie. "Stay inside, away from the windows." She nodded, wiping flour from her hands as the men hurried out. Through the kitchen window, she watched as Blake and several hands positioned themselves strategically around the yard, weapons ready but not aiming. The approaching riders slowed as they entered the ranch yard, their leader a tall man with a heavy beard and a scar running down one cheek. From her vantage point, Rosalie could see but not hear the exchange between this man and Blake, though the tense postures of everyone involved spoke of potential violence. After what seemed an eternity, the riders turned and departed, though not before the leader spat on the ground at Blake's feet. Only when they were well away did the ranch hands lower their weapons. Blake returned to the kitchen, his face grim. "Jacobson's men," he explained. "He owns the next ranch over and has been trying to push our boundaries for years. Claims some of our cattle have strayed onto his land." "Are they the ones who shot Tommy?" Rosalie asked. "Almost certainly, though we can't prove it." Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "They'll be back. Jacobson's not one to give up easily." "What will you do?" "Increase patrols. Make sure no one rides alone." His expression softened as he looked at her. "I don't want you going anywhere unescorted until this is resolved." Rosalie nodded, touched by his concern, despite the seriousness of the situation. "I'll be careful." Blake hesitated. "About what I was saying before we were interrupted." The dinner bell rang, signaling that the men were gathering for the evening meal. Rosalie glanced at the clock in surprise. She had lost track of time during the confrontation. "I need to serve dinner," she said, already moving to retrieve the pot of stew she had prepared earlier. Blake stepped aside. "We'll talk later," he promised, but later proved elusive. After dinner, a messenger arrived from a neighboring ranch with news that cattle were being driven through their northern pastures, possibly stolen from either the Flying F or another nearby spread. Blake and several men rode out immediately to investigate, not returning until well after midnight. The next morning brought rain a cold, steady downpour that turned the ranch yard to mud and kept most of the hands close to the buildings, making repairs and tending to equipment. Blake was closeted in the ranch office most of the day, catching up on accounts and correspondence after his night ride. Rosalie found herself oddly relieved by the postponement of their conversation. Her feelings for Blake had grown beyond what she had ever expected, and the possibility that he returned those feelings both thrilled and terrified her. What future could there be for a ranch foreman and a cook? Would he expect her to give up her position? Would she want to? These questions circled in her mind as she prepared a hearty dinner of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. The men, confined by the rain, were particularly appreciative of the meal and the warm apple pie that followed it. Blake lingered after the others had gone, helping her clear the table, an unprecedented assistance that drew knowing looks from the departing hands. "You don't need to do that," Rosalie protested as he stacked plates. "I want to," he replied simply. "Besides, it gives us a chance to finish our conversation." Rosalie's pulse quickened. "Yes, I suppose it does." They worked side by side in companionable silence until the dishes were washed and put away. Only then did Blake turn to face her directly. "Rosalie," he began, his voice soft but determined, "I've never been particularly good with words, at least not when they matter most. But I need you to know how I feel about you." She stilled, looking up at him with widening eyes. "From the moment you arrived at the Flying F, something changed. Not just the food or the cleaner house or the way the men stopped cursing so much." He smiled slightly. "Though all of that happened too. But what changed most was me." Blake took a step closer. "I've been alone for a long time. After the war, after leaving home, I convinced myself that was how I preferred it. Then you came along with your courage and your kindness and that remarkable stew, and suddenly being alone didn't seem so appealing anymore." "Blake," Rosalie whispered, her heart thundering in her chest. "I'm not a wealthy man," he continued. "I have some savings and prospects for more. Mr. Thompson has offered to sell me a section of land to start my own small spread in a year or two. It's not much to offer, but—" "It's everything," she interrupted softly. His eyes searched hers. "Does that mean—" "It means that I feel the same way," Rosalie said, finding courage in his vulnerability. "I came west looking for independence, for a place to belong on my own terms. I never expected to find someone who would make me want to belong with them instead." Blake's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hands, taking them gently in his own. "I meant what I said that first day," he murmured. "I wanted to keep you forever, though I was only thinking of your cooking at the time." Rosalie laughed softly. "And now? Now I know that your cooking is the least of your wonderful qualities, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't still high on the list." Their shared laughter broke the last of the tension between them. Blake's hands tightened on hers, and he drew her slowly closer. "May I kiss you, Rosalie Guthrie?" he asked, his voice husky. "Yes," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, and then with growing passion as she responded in kind. When they finally parted, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that first taste of stew." "I love you too," she replied, marveling at how natural the words felt. "Though it took me a bit longer to realize it. They might have stayed that way indefinitely had the back door not swung open, admitting a gust of rain-laden wind and a very wet ranch hand. "Sorry to interrupt, boss," the young cowboy said, looking embarrassed as he took in their close embrace. "But riders coming fast from town. Looks like trouble." Blake sighed, reluctantly releasing Rosalie. "I'll be right there." As the hand retreated, Blake turned back to her. "We'll continue this later?" "We'd better," she replied with a smile that made his eyes darken. The riders proved to be the sheriff and two deputies, bringing news that Jacobson's men had rustled cattle from another ranch and might be heading toward Flying F land to hide their theft. Blake and several hands rode out with the lawmen despite the rain and deepening darkness. Rosalie waited up, keeping coffee hot and preparing sandwiches for when they returned. It was past midnight when they finally rode in. Soaked to the skin, but successful, they had recovered the stolen cattle and captured two of the rustlers, though Jacobson himself and several others had escaped. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the rain replaced by a crystalline blue sky. Blake, running on little sleep, still found time to seek Rosalie out in the kitchen before heading to check on the recovered cattle. "I want to do this properly," he told her, taking her hands in his. "Will you marry me, Rosalie? Not right away if you're not ready, but sometime soon." Her heart felt too full for words, so she simply nodded, tears of happiness blurring her vision. His smile was radiant. "I'll speak to the pastor in town next time I'm there, and to Mr. Thompson, though I suspect he's been hoping for this outcome all along." "Is that why he hired me, to find you a wife?" Rosalie asked, half joking. Blake laughed. "I wouldn't put it past him. He's been telling me to settle down for years." He sobered slightly. "Are you sure, Rosalie? Life out here isn't easy, even with a home of our own someday." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I didn't come west looking for an easy life. I came looking for a meaningful one." He kissed her then, a brief but tender promise before reluctantly departing to his duties. The news of their engagement spread through the ranch faster than wildfire, meeting with universal approval from the hands, who seemed to view it as both inevitable and cause for celebration. Several of the older men went so far as to congratulate themselves for seeing it coming from day one. 2 weeks later, Gregory Thompson returned to the ranch and was delighted by the news. He insisted on hosting the wedding at the Flying F in the spring, when travel would be easier for the few guests they wished to invite. "Consider it my gift to you both," he told them. "That and the parcel of land we discussed, Foster. A wedding present with my blessing to build your own place there when you're ready." Winter settled over the Wyoming territory with its usual intensity-deep snows, biting winds, and long nights. But within the ranch house, warmth prevailed. Rosalie continued her duties as cook, but now with the understanding that she was preparing for her future role as Mrs. Foster. Blake, for his part, began planning the small house they would build on their land once the spring thaw arrived. In January, a letter arrived for Blake from his sister in Boston, responding to his news of the engagement with delight and a promise to attend the spring wedding. Enclosed was a small package for Rosalie, a delicate lace handkerchief that had belonged to their mother. "She wants you to carry it at our wedding," Blake explained, watching as Rosalie carefully unfolded the fragile fabric. "It's her way of welcoming you to the family." "It's beautiful," Rosalie whispered, deeply touched by the gesture from a woman she had yet to meet. February brought a brief thaw, allowing Blake and several hands to ride to the parcel of land that would soon be theirs. When they returned, Blake was full of plans and possibilities. "There's a perfect spot for a house on a small rise overlooking a creek," he told Rosalie excitedly. "Good water, sheltered from the worst winds, and fine grazing land all around. We can start with something modest and add to it as we go." "It sounds perfect," she replied, caught up in his enthusiasm. "When can I see it?" "As soon as the trails are clear enough, another few weeks perhaps." March arrived with alternating snow and sunshine, the days gradually lengthening as spring approached. One clear morning, Blake announced it was time for Rosalie to see their future home. They rode out together, Blake on his favorite gelding, and Rosalie on a gentle mare borrowed from Thompson's personal stable. The journey took most of the morning, but when they crested a final hill and Blake pointed ahead, Rosalie gasped in delight. Below them lay a small valley, still touched with snow in the shadowed places, but showing green where the sun had warmed the earth. A clear creek wound through it, bordered by cottonwoods just beginning to bud. On a slight rise stood 4 wooden stakes marking the corners of what would become their home. "Blake, it's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the panoramic view of rolling hills and distant mountains. "You really like it?" he asked, watching her face carefully. "I love it," she assured him. "I can already imagine our house here, a garden there by the creek, perhaps some fruit trees eventually." They dismounted and Blake spread a blanket on a dry patch of ground. From his saddlebags, he produced a simple lunch bread, cheese, and dried fruit, along with a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. As they ate, they talked of their plans, the house they would build, the small herd of cattle they would start with, the children they hoped for eventually. The future stretched before them, full of promise despite the inevitable challenges of frontier life. "I never expected to find this," Rosalie admitted, leaning against Blake's shoulder as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. "When I came west, I was only looking for independence, maybe adventure. I never thought I'd find a home, or love. And I never thought I'd find someone who would make me want to settle in one place permanently," Blake replied, his arm around her shoulders. "You've given me a reason to build something lasting, Rosalie." They rode back to the ranch as the day waned, both quiet but content in the knowledge of what lay ahead. That evening, as Rosalie served her now famous stew to the hands, there was a special joy in knowing that soon she would be cooking it in her own kitchen for her own family. April brought the official end of winter, though occasional snowstorms still swept through. Construction began on their house, with Blake and several ranch hands working whenever their regular duties allowed. Thompson, true to his word, provided lumber and other materials as part of his wedding gift. The wedding was set for the first weekend in May. Rosalie, with help from the pastor's wife in town, fashioned a simple but elegant dress from fine fabric ordered from Denver. Blake's sister arrived a week before the ceremony, a lively woman named Elizabeth, who immediately bonded with Rosalie over shared stories of Blake's stubbornness. The day of the wedding dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony was held in the ranch yard, which had been transformed with wildflowers and ribbons. Every hand on the Flying F attended, alongside neighbors from nearby ranches and a few townspeople who had come to know and respect the couple. Rosalie carried Elizabeth's handkerchief tucked in her sleeve as she walked toward Blake, who waited beside the pastor, looking handsome and slightly nervous in his best suit. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising love and faithfulness through whatever life might bring. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and more food than even Rosalie had ever prepared before, though she had insisted on making her special stew herself as part of the wedding feast. "For luck," she told Blake with a smile, "since it's what brought us together." "I'll never taste stew again without thinking of that moment," he replied, taking her hand in his. "Best decision I ever made, keeping you forever." 2 weeks after the wedding, their house was complete enough to move in a solid 2-room cabin, with plans for expansion already drawn. Rosalie stood in the doorway of their new home, watching as Blake carried in the last of their few belongings. "What do you think, Mrs. Foster?" he asked, setting down the trunk and coming to stand beside her. "Is it what you imagined?" Rosalie turned to him, her heart full. "It's better," she said softly, "because it's ours." Blake gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that still made her knees weak. "Welcome home, Rosalie." As they settled into their new life together, Rosalie often thought back to that first day at the Flying F, to the moment when a tired, dusty foreman had tasted her stew and declared he would keep her forever. What had begun as a simple compliment to a cook had become a promise fulfilled in ways neither of them could have imagined, and every time she made that special stew in their own kitchen, with the scent of home-baked bread filling the air and the sound of Blake's boots on the porch announcing his return from the range, Rosalie knew that she had found exactly what she had been seeking when she journeyed west Independence. Yes, but also belonging, purpose, and a love that would last forever. 10 years later, the small cabin had grown into a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The Foster Ranch, as it was now known, had prospered under Blake's careful management and Rosalie's practical support. Their cattle herd numbered in the hundreds, and their reputation for fair dealing had spread throughout the territory. But their greatest pride was their family 8-year-old twins, James and Sarah, who had their father's blue eyes and their mother's determination, and 4-year-old Daniel, who already showed signs of being a natural horseman. The house rang with children's laughter and the everyday sounds of a happy home. On the 10th anniversary of the day Rosalie had first arrived at the Flying F, Blake surprised her with a special gift, a beautiful Dutch oven, cast iron with a copper lid, far finer than anything available in the local stores. "I had it ordered from Chicago," he explained as she admired it. "I thought you might use it to make that stew that changed our lives." Rosalie laughed, touching the smooth metal reverently. "After all these years, you're still thinking about that stew." "I'm thinking about the woman who made it," Blake corrected, pulling her into his arms. "The woman who had the courage to travel alone to an unknown place, who healed our wounds and fed our bodies, and somehow found room in her heart for a weathered cowboy who didn't know what he was missing until she arrived." "That cowboy cleaned up rather nicely," Rosalie teased, leaning into his embrace. At 40, Blake was still strong and handsome, the years adding character rather than age to his face. "And you," he said softly, "are even more beautiful now than you were then." They stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard with the puppies from their dog's recent litter. In the distance, cattle grazed on lush spring grass, and beyond them, the mountains stood eternal against the Wyoming sky. "Did you ever imagine this?" Blake asked, his arm around her waist. "That first day, when I said I'd keep you forever, did you have any idea what it would become?" Rosalie smiled, thinking of the uncertain young woman she had been, stepping off that stagecoach into a new world. "No," she admitted, "but I'm grateful every day that you meant those words, even if you were only thinking of my cooking at the time." Blake laughed, the sound still her favorite in the world. "The cooking was just the beginning," he said. "Keeping you forever has been the greatest joy of my life." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rosalie leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. Surrounded by the life they had built together, a life that had begun with a journey into the unknown and a simple pot of stew that had changed everything,